Welcome to Big Closet, Small Planet and this special edition focused on climate action from the Scandinavian Textile Initiative for Climate Action. My name is Mike Schrager. Today, we're talking to an expert who is, as I would say, working with decarbonization on the ground in some of the countries where some of the biggest climate impacts are taking place for the apparel industry supply chain. And so I thought it was important to speak to someone today who could give us a perspective from both their experience working in a big brand and their work, but also now working in the field of stakeholders working to decarbonize, how they think it's going. So we're lucky to have Peter Ford with us. Peter, good to have you. Peter, maybe you're probably better at it, introducing yourself, who you are, your background, what you've done, so the audience understands why I invited you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you. I hope I say some things that are interesting to the audience, and let's see if, we can get some action out of a few things from today. Who am I? I've spent the last 20 years living and working across Asia and parts of West Africa in many different roles and responsibilities. But what is most pertinent to this call are the 6 years I've just spent working at H&M Group, where I spent 4 of those years overseeing the factory level decarbonisation program globally. So that was for about 1,500 factories at the time. And the two or so years before that, with H&M, I was out in Cambodia overseeing the factory level environment sustainability programs for Cambodia, Vietnam, and Myanmar. So, a lot of hands-on and factory level experience in that regard. And then, as of today, I am back in Cambodia working for EnergyLab, which is a non-profit policy impact organization working to really drive clean energy uptake and support and growth primarily in Cambodia, but also across the region as well.
Okay, so you have great experience in recently in what this is actually going to require or what is happening, I would argue, but we can talk about that throughout. I just have an initial question because of where you've been sitting and your perspective. If you were to do a quick rating, right? Rating how well the apparel industry, the textile industry is doing in decarbonization on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is we're doing it terribly. It's a catastrophe. 5 is we are doing it extremely well. It's going great. Yahoo! Where would you place, based on your expertise, us?
Well, for those who know me personally, I can often be not always the optimist, but in this regard, I'm more optimistic than others. I would say as an industry as a whole, maybe we're at 3.5. But there are a few brands that are really doing most of the hard work. And for them and their decarbonization goals, they're closer to 4.5 out of 5, I think. But the industry as a whole is not working in unison. Some brands are doing the heavy lifting, and some are doing what appears to be to others nothing at all. So lots of work to be done.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you another very current question. Do you think this whole development with the tariffs being pushed by the United States is going to have a positive, negative, or neutral effect? And as we're talking, we're in mid to late April, so things can change on a dime. But as of now, what are you thinking?
Yeah, as of today, I would say it's too early to tell. I think there can be some positives and some negatives from this on the decarbonization work. I think in the short term, a lot of investments, both in factory expansion, but also then in factory decarbonization, will be put on pause to see how the dust settles. And so I think that will definitely slow down immediate action and impacts. And I think potentially what we'll see over time is that garment production is moved to countries that are not currently on a tariff list. So I think, again, this is all hypothetical, but in the lessons learned from COVID about the issues of very consolidated supply chains have seen a lot of expansion into other parts of the world for garments, and very few of those countries are currently on the tariff list. So if these tariffs do stick, production could be shifting to parts of the world that have not seen large-scale fabric production before.
Can you give me an example of where that would be, for instance?
Well, Guatemala, El Salvador, Togo, for example,
Okay.
I'm aware of. So I think those are both opportunities and challenges. If these national grids have a high renewable energy component and a clear framework for transparency on renewable electricity, then this could be a positive shift. But if these countries do not have such frameworks, if labor unions are not established and are working well, if monitoring by the authorities of environmental risk is not up to scratch, then we are potentially just shifting the decarbonisation challenge around rather than improving anything, unfortunately. But time will tell.
Time will tell. So based on your rating of 3.5, which you said you're a little bit more optimistic than in other areas, perhaps, it seems like you think that there's some progress in the industry. There is some positivity that you have regarding reaching our climate targets. Do you think there's a distinction between, are we going to be able to meet our 2030 targets easily or sort of within reach, but 2040 targets are much more questionable? Or is there no difference? How would you distinguish where we are between the 2030 and 2040, 2050 kind of approach?
No, I think, maybe to explain where some of my optimism comes from, one of the great joys of my previous role in H&M Group was really being hands-on at the factory level, identifying areas of improvement, both for energy efficiency and fuel switching and process electrification with the team of engineers that we had, but also then talking with service providers and with governments even, and really being at the front line of change and of impact and really driving that. We were able to pilot some groundbreaking technologies that hadn't really been seen in garment factories before, such as heat pumps that can generate steam instead of just hot water, using thermal heat storage in China to really maximize the electricity grid and clean electricity. And so these things, they are in factories, they are working. It's not just theory. And so I think it's a great source of optimism. So then to get back to your question, I think the 2030 targets for the garment sector, which under the UNFCCC Fashion Charter is basically a 50% cut in absolute emissions. I think the industry will hit those if it can align and prioritize on sourcing renewable electricity in key production markets, whether that ideally through corporate power purchase agreements and on-site renewable generation, and at worst case unbundled IREC certificates, but really doing their best to demonstrate the importance of sourcing renewable electricity, and I think also the continued coal replacement at the factory level. That is both a UNFCCC requirement again, no on-site coal by 2030. And there are a handful of brands that are working to have that in place by the end of this year. And so the actions of a few brands and really driving the change of fuel replacement is going to see an industry-wide impact that should, I'm sure, hit the 2030 target of that basically 50% cut in emissions. I think where things get a little bit more challenging is to see where the 2040 impacts can be had. So this is where it gets a little bit looser because brands' net zero commitments vary. H&M Group, for example, was at 2040, so it needed to see a 90% reduction in absolute emissions. And I think this is where it's slightly harder to sit there with my eyes closed and imagine an emission-free garment sector. But if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said it was literally impossible. But some of the advancements in the past year, and especially some of the pilots that are ongoing at the moment, really do offer a level of optimism that I think it really should be championed and shouted about and moved forward, and really does need the alignment of everyone in the sector. And this is really, we're focusing on the tier 2 layers of supply chain here. So the fabric mills and the processing mills, which is where the vast majority of emissions are in the garment sector, and the hardest to abate as well, because so much of that energy, up to about 90% of that energy is for thermal heat demand. So making water hot for the dyeing process and some of the other finishing processes.
Okay, so we're going to get
Sorry if
into that.
I've gone too far.
No. I know. I can say how much you know and how passionate you are about this. This is very good. I just wanted to circle back before we get into that, because that is very specific and where we want to be. But we also talked about, you alluded to that certain companies are doing well, or maybe ahead of the pack, but the rest of the industry maybe is not doing enough, or perhaps is not as engaged. But you also implied that those few companies may be pulling the rest of the industry with them. Uh, am I understanding that correctly? Because my sense is that if there's just a handful of brands, and I don't know if you or retailers or manufacturers sort of leading the way, and you can name them or not if you're comfortable or not. But can they be enough of a driver to pull the rest of the actors who are not doing anything or not doing enough?
So I'm happy to name the positive ones, and let's see what you can drag out of me for the those that are not doing so well. But
Okay.
I mean, clearly H&M Group, I'm biased, but you just have to read the Fashion Revolution annual reports or the Stand.Earth reports that come out, and you can see, the brands that are doing well. So H&M Group, Ralph Lauren, Adidas, Decathlon, Puma, and Bestseller out of Denmark, it really improving and really driving action. These are often the loudest voices at UNFCCC events and some of the other stakeholder events. You've got Mango, Gap, VF Corp, and Lululemon are also, really increasing their ambition, joining some activities and some initiatives to drive impact. But obviously, by omission, there are, the world's largest fashion house is not on that list. Uniqlo and fast retailing also not there, and others that I think customers would expect to be at the top of any decarbonization and sustainability action. Often are very quiet or secretive, or just not doing anything that can be witnessed by anyone else.
Okay, so you're referring to the analysis from the Fashion Revolution.
So that always helps. I would point at that to back up what I'm saying about the brands. It's not just my opinion on this one. Fashion Revolution's State of Decarbonization report, I think we're due for a new one shortly. I think they've sent out the surveys.
That's right.
Yeah. And that will really highlight those who are doing the most, and those that are doing absolutely nothing at all. I think, most of your audience should know this, but your average tier 1 factory, so the final cut, make, and trim, there's probably 5 or 6 major brands working in any given factory, different levels of output, but all that should be and can be communicating with the factory on sustainability initiatives, and really pushing for action. At the tier 2 level, that can be up to 20 different brands sourcing fabrics from a different facility. And again, this gives huge potential for voice and message and urgency to be shared with suppliers, but is often only coming from a handful of brands. And suppliers would support me on this claim as well. They hear a lot from H&M on what needs to be done. They would hear a lot from Levi's, for example, on water topics. They hear a lot from 1 or 2 other brands, but notable silence from many. And that gets me onto the supplier action as well. As you asked, some are really trying very hard and are clearly doing well. Crystal Group, for example, early adopters in rooftop solar in Vietnam and other places, and very vocal on panels and discussions around the world on the work that they're doing and of the need to do more. But I think, there are others that speak well on panels about what they're doing, but it's not really supported by the data, or they only talk about removing coal from their tier one suppliers, for example, and are very happy to continue burning coal at their tier two suppliers, even where alternative fuels are available and have been identified for them by brands that source with them. So there's a mixed bag. Obviously, a lot of the fuel switching discussions do carry a cost increase for suppliers. And so these are discussions that need to be had with their brands. I'm not trying to say this is easy or demonize suppliers for inaction, but I think a stronger, clearer message from the brands that they're working with would really speed up impact globally, rather than just a handful of suppliers that, for whatever internal reasons, have taken this more seriously than others.
Okay, and we're going to come back to that on the macro level, on a strategy for the industry, and if one strategy that's being proposed uh, from the Apparel Impact Institute is a good one. But I just want to circle back again to, you gave me two messages here. You said on one hand, there's a handful, and you've just listed those, of leaders uh, supported by some analysis. And then also there's a lot, of course, who are missing from that leaderboard, who are maybe not doing anything. And yet at the same time, you said you were relatively optimistic that the industry could meet its 2030 targets. So is there anything there I'm missing, which is you think that a couple brands can drive change for the whole industry, a couple suppliers, or have I misunderstood you?
So I think from the brand perspective, again, because of that shared um, usage of factories, all it takes is for one of the ambitious brands to be sourcing from a factory for the whole factory's decarbonisation journey to be sped up. It's bigger than the sum of the parts, I would say, in that regard. Also, because of the actions of a few, especially when it comes to coal phase out, it's also kind of given an example to other brands that maybe were on the fence or thought this was an impossible task, that it really can be done. Your average brand is following the UNFCCC commitment for a 2030 phase out of on-site coal, whereas Adidas, Ralph Lauren, Decathlon, and I think Puma for a number of their suppliers have been working on a 2025 phase out of coal, and H&M Group in its most recent sustainability report just committed to 2026, including all the way down to tier 3 spinning and tannery units as well. So this advantage of the handful of brands that are doing all the work, they can both hopefully give optimism and support to other brands that are nervous on this journey but are trying, as well as simply by working through the factories where they're sourcing from, getting that impact that others are then just benefiting from anyway. So
Okay.
it's again, the
Now I
optimism is
understand.
there, I promise.
Yeah, that's well, Peter, usually negative or more pessimistic. So we know this means something. You mentioned as we got into this that part of the optimism comes from some breakthrough technologies or
Mhm.
implementation of breakthrough technologies. And you started to talk about also thermal heat and such, thermal energy. Um, are you talking about like waterless dyeing, because water and using the steam and all those sorts of things creates a need for so much energy? What is it that's you think is breaking through, that's gone from sort of pilot and sort of pie in the sky to wow, this could actually happen?
So I think for me, the most exciting avenue here is the waterless dyeing journey that we're on. Um, I think the numbers escape me off the top of my head, but I think 70% of the entire carbon emissions or energy demand for the garment sector at production level is at the tier 2 level, and its need for hot water and steam. And up until this point, all meaningful decarbonisation action that has taken place at tier 2s has simply been fuel replacement. So switching from coal to, in places like Turkey and China, a lot of that's shifted to fossil gas. Um, in places like Vietnam and India, a lot of that shift has gone to sustainable biomass, so rice husk waste. And in a few small spaces, it's gone to electricity and renewable electricity. But that's really been the only way that any action and any impact could have happened. And you're not really changing anything. I mean, changing the fuel is wonderful, but the beast remains, as it were. And so the waterless dyeing revolution, there we go, let's call it what it is, in my opinion, which is really only happening right now at any scale outside of the laboratory or at tiny factories, can, according to the manufacturers of this technology, cut energy demand by 70 to 80%. And if you can cut that much need for energy from the most energy intensive part of the garment space, you can suddenly feel more optimistic about both, meaningful impact, but also then opening up electrification of that remaining steam production and shifting away from the need to burn anything at a factory to make water hot, and really going straight to electricity and then sourcing that electricity transparently from renewable sources.
Yeah, I think as I understand it, that the challenge now is if you're trying to make all of that energy electric based, that's really, really hard. But if you cut the demand for that energy by a significant amount, the remaining part that's not cut could be addressed by electric grids, which are powered by renewable energy. Is that how I understand it?
Yeah, exactly. Currently, for any medium to large tier 2 mill in the world, it's almost impossible to convert that energy demand into an electric alternative today. You would need new power stations into the national grid, and you would need new transformers at the factories. And that's just the technology before we even get into the cost of this and the ability to source that from renewable sources. But if you can cut that energy demand drastically, then it really does become exciting in what's available. If you're in a market like mainland China, where then there's incredibly cheap off-peak electricity prices, then you can suddenly also then add technologies such as thermal heat storage. So you can store electricity as heat when it's its cheapest, and then you can use that heat to make your water hot as needed. And you can, if you've got a corporate power purchase agreement, then all of that electricity is clearly and transparently certified renewable. And this is, again, genuinely game-changing for this space. It will, change how clothing is made. And that can't be said for anything that we've really tried up until now in the decarbonisation space. All we've been doing is band-aids on top of things. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I've heard about waterless dyeing for 15 years and more. And I think you're the first person who's really said this is moving now from sort of a test, a pilot, something that has a lot of potential, to something that's being implemented. And it sounds like you're very or relatively optimistic that this could be the thing that gets us much closer to the goal.
I think some of it was wishful thinking, well, not wishful thinking, but it has to happen. Otherwise, the 2040 targets are impossible in the current landscape. So yes, I'm putting a lot of myself into this optimism, but the initial reports from the pilots that are underway seem to be very positive. So I'm not sharing any trade secrets. There's press releases on this, but H&M Group is working in Bangladesh with Chorka Textile, and it's piloting the combination of 3 waterless dyeing technologies, Revozona, Imogo, and Pluvia, and that is anticipated to have great results. And the pilot is underway, and is I believe giving positive data already. And then in India at Arvind, H&M again, but working with Fashion for Good this time, is also supporting the Devon Supercriticals pilot. So a different technology, but with similar stated outcomes. And these are pilots at scale, at production scale. It's not a nice technology that works in a lab at this point. This would have the ability to replace whole dyeing lines, or at least be added to any expansions or to new factories as they're built. So yeah, it really is moving forward.
Okay. It's interesting because I don't hear a lot of noise, positive noise about this from other angles, from other channels. So maybe we heard it here that this is maybe where everything should be moving or is moving to make a big dent in reaching the targets. Let me ask you about the sort of change ecosystem um, for the industry. So we have industry-led initiatives. We of course have platforms that have been around a while, like now called Cascal and other membership-driven platforms. Then we have specific initiatives, like you mentioned, the Fashion Charter, UN Fashion Charter, and the Fashion Pact. And these platforms tend to outline and engage companies, some of the biggest companies in the world. Some of them you mentioned. I think the Fashion Pact's move was very much about getting CEOs and owners on board to the journey. Um, how helpful or not helpful do you think these initiatives are in driving change?
God, I mean, I think maybe I'll take it one step back. And most brands do not have adequate knowledge of their supply chains. And so they might sign commitments, but they don't really know what that means. And so it's very easy to sign something and then sit back and kind of wait for others to do the work. Like most brands, hopefully at this point, fully understand their tier one supply chain, but not that many fully understand their tier two supply chains. And, especially the case then of tier three and spinning. And so these commitments are only as good as the data that the brands have and the transparency that the brands are prepared to share. So I think, again, brands that are willing to take leadership in these pacts and these coalitions and these commitments, to really share fully their supply chains as best they have knowledge, using Open Supply Hub and others to really demonstrate that they're trying their best, and also being honest to the challenges that face them, whether that's in their sustainability reports or again at panels and discussions of these groups. Then I think all of this has value and is driving things forward. But there are still major brands out there, Inditex, for example, that doesn't publish its supply chain at all anywhere publicly. So I would question their commitment to anything that they've signed if they're not yet willing to be transparent about where they're even placing their orders. And I think this is where some of these groups and these commitments fall down, is that it's very easy to say nice words and talk about the future, but if you're not showing it and leading it and pulling up the rug and showing what's hidden underneath, then it really does, to me, lack credibility and also hinders the work that others are trying to do. If you don't know which other brands you're sharing your supply chain with, it's harder to actually meaningfully collaborate or identify factories that need extra support in decarbonisation, or those that are belligerently not improving for whatever reason. Or all of these discussions are made much easier with transparency, and will really support Fashion Pact and UNFCCC and the handful of others in doing the work they're trying to do.
And I understand, for instance, just to give something concrete, I don't want to just focus on the negative, but I know there was a group in the Fashion Charter which was committed to coal phase out. And I don't believe, am I right? I don't think it ever happened. Like,
Oh yes, that was a 2-year endeavor. I oversaw the coal action phase out group within the UNFCCC. Best of my knowledge, not a single factory phased out coal that wasn't going to do so already, and that was really led by Adidas and H&M and a few others that had this 2025, 2026 timeline. Any brand that was not working at that speed had, there was some passionate voices, but there were no budgets available to those other brands to really have change, and there was no clarity of message from the brands to their own suppliers on the need to act. So total failure. Let's call it what it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's keep on the ecosystem of change. I don't know if that's too pretentious of a word, but um, you mentioned NGOs, right? You mentioned Stand Earth, Action Speaks Louder, Fashion Revolution. I don't know if you mentioned Change in Markets. These are some of the more outspoken NGOs, watchdogs, some would call themselves. There's others that have a very important role to play in the European Union. What do you think of the demands raised by these? Do you have any views? It seems like you're using some of their analysis, at least Fashion Revolution and Action Speaks Louder, for some of your analyses. How do you feel about their role, and how helpful are their demands, et cetera?
I think, broadly, very helpful and do provide a useful voice within the industry, or from outside the industry, shouting at it. It's both a motivator and a driving light for a lot of brands. You actually want to be first on Fashion Revolution's list, or if Puma gets more points, what did they do? Studying their sustainability reports, or if you're connected with people at these brands, directly asking them. So for some of the brands that are motivated to be near the top, I think these reports are fantastic. But as you can see from reading any of these reports, there is only a handful at the top. There's a few in the middle that are improving, and there's a whole bunch who are not motivated at all by such reports or by being seen as leaders in this space. And since leaving H&M, I've been able to actually work with a few of these groups to add a little bit more nuance, maybe, to some of their messaging when it comes for calls for the electrification of the industry. What should be a long-term ambition, and what is a more feasible short-term ambition, and same when it comes to sustainable biomass calls as well. In the past, some of the NGO calls have sounded somewhat naive to those within the industry, not for lack of passion or for lack of drive, but simply some of the things were literally impossible to implement in some of the timelines that were being called for. So a little bit more nuance there, a little bit more support on what is feasible. And I think moving forward, such calls will be listened to by more people and actually be acted upon, I hope. And no, I welcome every new report that comes out. There are some that are motivated to improve based on how they're mentioned in these reports. And again, all it takes is a few more brands to increase their ambition and speed up their timelines. And the critical mass of impact with the way this factories are spread out globally really should have meaningful impact on decarbonisation. So no, I support it.
Yeah. And I'm going to think about also the Science-Based Targets Initiative method. Mm-hmm. Some strong voices argue that the method is unfair to supply chain partners, right? That one must take into consideration that different markets have different energy possibilities, some more, some less. There should be differentiated approach. Some companies have already reduced a lot. They don't have that much more they can do in terms of decarb. How is your view on this? Is this a fair assessment of the limitations of the SBTi, and should it be adjusted?
Well, yeah, short answer is the SBTi is the best we've got, and no challenger is forthcoming. So, we have to work with it and we have to utilize it as best we can. I think, the discussions on this split down two parts. One is, the brand-led commitments, and the other is the efforts to push more and more suppliers into making their own commitments and setting their own targets. And for me personally, that focus on the suppliers isn't helpful and shouldn't be where things are focused. Because, as you say, it does then open up some of the geographical challenges and inequities that do exist. Whereas at a brand level SBTi commitment, you have the whole world with which to find your 56% carbon cuts. And so if you're working in some markets that are seeing dramatic and meaningful impact, such as India and Vietnam, who are replacing coal and switching that to sustainable biomass, then suppliers in these markets can see carbon reductions at a much greater volume and a much greater speed than some of their factories in Bangladesh, for example, where impact is basically flat at the moment because factories generate almost all of their electricity and heat from fossil gas and don't have the capacity to decarbonize either of that. So at the brand level, using that global perspective, I don't see a problem with SBTi at all. And I think it is helpful. It offers that clarity. It offers that roadmap and allows brands to think across their supply chain, where can they get maximum impact in the short term to meet their shorter term commitments, and where can they plan strategically longer term to hit their 2040 or 2050 goals.
Okay.
Did that answer your question? Sorry.
It did. And I'm, as everyone can hear, I'm thinking about this approach, which we're not going to dig deeper into now, but the idea that, for instance, a buyer or a brand, as you say, can sort of look at its full pie of impacts around the supply chain around the globe and say, okay, how do I intervene in different ones to reach my SBTi target or my science-informed target? Whereas, as you say, a particular factory or manufacturer may be limited by where they are currently producing, and therefore that target may be unrealistic based on the SBTi method. And so we're talking into a little bit carbon intensity as a method for a brand or a buyer, but not necessarily for a manufacturer. So I think that's quite interesting that you see that there is a nuance there that should be considered when asking supply chain partners to make commitments to decarbonization. Let's take a step back. I just have two more questions for you. You're doing well, Peter. You feeling all right?
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I hope I'm clear and not getting lost on too many rabbit holes for the audience.
No, not at all. In my opinion, I don't know what the audience thinks, but I think you're doing great. If we think about the big picture, you mentioned a relatively positive view on 2030, reaching 2030 targets. There are organizations like Apparel Impact Institute who has, as I understand it, a target of reaching 1,500 of the most, greenhouse gas polluting factories, right? Instead of focusing on every factory in the world, there are some that, based on data that I believe is from the Higg Index, seem to be the most carbon intensive, or I don't know if that's the word, carbon polluting. And by focusing on those 1,500, we have more of a shot of reaching the 2030 targets or the 2040 targets, and not wasting our time on that part of the curve or the tail that's not that you don't get such a return on an investment when it comes to decarbonization. What do you think about that approach, or do you have another view on the sort of industry approach overall to get to these goals?
No, I think this is what's been needed. For years, some of us have been calling for Cascale and or AII to really highlight who are the largest, most energy intensive suppliers in this industry and allow people to focus on that. If you're a brand that isn't collecting its own primary data from factories, you really don't know how your suppliers stack up on a regional or global level. There is no industry benchmarking. And so starting to benchmark this and starting to highlight the highest energy users is a very important step. And I think, we're still waiting for full clarity on where these suppliers are, but my guess would be they were in a handful of countries. So it kind of goes back to that geographical spread question from before as well, which is, this is not 1,500 dotted around the world. This will be most likely in Taiwan, mainland China, one or two in Vietnam, one or two in Bangladesh, and one or two in India as well, I think, maybe Indonesia. And so looking at the energy that is available in these markets, what where is the impact going to come from here? Is it fuel switching? Is it electrification? Or is it simply that some of these factories are just behemoths that are not future ready and are future focused? So starting with this approach, working with brands that are interested in this approach, I think will really drive impact, especially for 2030 targets, where energy efficiency and sourcing of renewable electricity, it will be enough to really get the industry to where it needs to be for 2030. 2040, where we really need to be thinking about 100% electric tier 2, and we already have electric tier 3. That is a much bigger challenge to overcome. But again, this clarity of suppliers will really drive that and help everyone.
So, in finally completing part of the pieces of this ecosystem, we talk about legislation at the EU level, the US, in individual countries. There's always a debate about whether or not legislation is robust enough, smart enough, targeted enough, in time enough. What do you have any particular views on the role of politicians and legislation in driving all this to accelerate this decarbonization? Are there certain things that would help from your perspective, given your experience?
I think I can answer that in two ways. You've got local legislation, and then global, I mean, the UN, but regional, what is the EU doing? What are parts of the US doing? And at the local level, legislation can really have an impact. In India, Delhi region banned coal in factories last year, I think it was, or maybe even the year before. And that is an example of where factories have to join the decarbonization journey, whether they want to or not, have to start switching fuel and doing it at a scale that will actually improve the air quality of the communities, but also really drive the industry forward and make its data look much more attractive to international buyers as well. So local legislation is key. The nature of the garment sector and the locations that it's traditionally been put in, you could argue, has been because there isn't much local policy and legislation, and unlikely to be anything that would be anti-business. But I think that needs to change moving forward as the world hopefully unites on decarbonization and climate change as a topic that it can agree on, at least outside of the US, maybe on that one. And then speaking more globally, at legislation level, CBAM and what the EU is trying to do, I think is really important. Even though it doesn't apply to
border adjustment, it's not applying to
mechanism,
textiles
yes,
right now. Yeah,
it doesn't apply to textiles yet, but the more progressive European brands are acting as if it's going to. And so therefore it's already having an impact. It's already driving decisions. It's already having people thinking about a carbon price on, where clothing is made, which grids and energy systems are lower carbon, and what would it cost to support suppliers to decarbonize or fuel switch in some of these markets versus identifying markets that have cleaner energy already today. And so I think that's another one. And then you've got in the US, it's California that's looking at the Fashion Act after New York's unsuccessful efforts. California seems to be picking up that mantle, and let's see what can be done in US states as well. Whatever happens with these tariffs moving forward may or may not support or impede that. But at least it is yet another major market for garments looking at carbon and at climate with a critical lens and really trying to drive it home. And again, optimistic that this will support.
So my final question to you, because I want to sort of bring it back around to how you were relatively optimistic on the progress when it comes to specifically decarbonization. I don't know if you've read our latest STICA report. If you haven't, I'm going to push that to you and demand that you take a look at all the analyses. Obviously, STICA and our work includes H&M, but also includes lots of medium and smaller brands. And when we do the math, we look at sort of that companies could potentially reduce their per product emissions, right? By becoming more efficient and sourcing from places with renewable energy or better energy efficiency. But generally, because they need to grow as a commercial company, often that growth outstrips their total reductions, right? So I think it's interesting that you see that that's not necessarily a problem maybe for the industry as a whole, because you seem to be alluding to that there can be a potentially decoupling between sort of decarbonization and growth, that we can reduce emissions at the same time keeping or increasing growth. Am I misunderstanding your view of that, or do you see that as a more fundamental problem?
Well, I mean, the commitments that the brands have made under their SBTi's expect and require a decoupling of emissions from growth. H&M Group, for example, sorry to keep using them, but I've got best knowledge. They needed a 56% cut in absolute carbon emissions by 2030 from a 2019 baseline, and that is at the same time expecting growth to double over that timeline as well. So cutting carbon emissions by more than half while increasing production and sales double. So and they're on track to succeed on that. So it really can be done. I think it's not easy, but these fundamental ways of shifting this waterless dyeing, if it can be good enough to scale by 2040, as I'm praying and hoping for, really does allow for that. The biggest challenge today is the increased cost in switching from a high carbon fuel to a low carbon source. That is where people see the challenge in this, and where there is most reluctance to then have to have action. And if that can be continued to be supported, if electrification of processes, of cutting overall energy demand at the factory level, of changing the dyeing process, and of recovering heat from production processes like stentors and some of the other parts of the factory where money is literally being burned and wasted. I think it's a much easier future to imagine, where emissions and growth are decoupled. I think it's much easier. And I am, still, after all of this, optimistic that it can be done.
Peter, is there anything else you think we need to know about decarbonizing the apparel industry that you haven't articulately spoken about? You've covered a lot, my friend.
I think, to me, it really is the transparency, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. There should be more and more calls from everyone involved in having this as transparent as possible. It really does boost potential collaboration and helps consumers really cut through the marketing and the brand hype and see who is actually acting or who isn't at all. Please read Fashion Revolution report and others from other parties in the industry, and have some optimism. That's it can be done, and visit factories. My gosh, the number of panels that I've joined over the years for people that really haven't had recent experience at the factory level, seen where some of these changes are going. The technology is progressing much faster than our knowledge of it in the industry as a whole. So, please get out to visit factories as best you can.
Oh, Peter, you've made my day, I must say. With all the negative vibes going around globally, your relative optimism is pretty optimistic. Thank you. Anyway, brilliant. Thank you for educating all of us based on your expertise, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I hope, I was clear. I can be found on LinkedIn if anyone has follow-up questions or comments. And if you have any particular interest in Cambodia on clean energy, on factory decarbonisation as well, please reach out. It is my current area of employment and interest. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.